All right. Um, I realized that the syllabus didn't tell you that you had to read Haidt's article on morality. But this is a very hot topic. This guy is making the rounds for the press junkets. He's publishing a lot right now. And the stuff he's writing about is extremely relevant to what we read in McIntyre and Herka and Beats, as well as some other topics we're going to look at in this class. So I figured I'd launch into this article as well and discuss it. Jonathan Haidt is the primary author of this article. That's who's pictured here. He's a social psychologist at the at New York University right now. Prior to that, he was at the University of Virginia. And he wrote a book last year called The Righteous Mind, which explores the psychological, I guess, foundations or explanations for the deep-seated, contentious, divisive political divide we have in our country, I guess, between conservatives and liberals. He kind of looks at the psychological foundations of that agreement and the kind of psychology of conservatives and the psychology of liberals as a way of explaining kind of just this impasse we have in our political debates between the right and the left. So this was the book he wrote. It's called A Righteous Mind, and that book is kind of an expansion of what we read in the short article I signed. In fact, some of the stuff in this lecture is going to be pulled from the book and not from the article. So that's the American cover, the Righteous Mind: Why Good People Are Divided by Politics and Religion. The European cover I found more interesting. This was in Britain, but for some reason the American press didn't want that cover. So anyways, this book got Jonathan Haidt onto the Colbert Report, a number of news channels, and people are still talking about him. And since he's so relevant to what we're talking about in this class, it's worth bringing him up as well. Again, this is cutting edge stuff. In graduate seminars I've taken, they're reading some of his stuff. Normally, you wouldn't get this in an undergraduate class, but you're lucky to have me as your instructor. All right, let's just dive right in. So Haidt talks about the old morality, or what basically his target's the same thing that McIntyre calls the liberal morality. So consequentialism, deontology, Wallace's view. That's not the old morality. The old morality would be more like the embedded selves view, or the particularism, the view that, according to McIntyre, can justify patriotism. All right, so let's talk about that. Haidt characterizes the old morality as follows: 1. He notes humans have been codifying morality for as long as they've had written language, and they've had written language for quite a while. Morality, law, and religion, until recently, were generally heavily intertwined. In fact, in many places in the world, they still are. This notion of separation of church and state is foreign to a lot of people throughout time and place. It's a very Western notion. It's an Enlightenment notion. Towards the Axial Age, about 800 to 200 BC, rules of law and morals got supplemented with a sophisticated psychology of moral virtue. The most famous of which was offered by Aristotle, a Greek philosopher, in his book Nicomachean Ethics, which we're not going to cover in this class, but if you ever want to read, it's a fascinating read. I highly encourage you to take Ethics 111 at Purdue University, possibly taught by me, but I may not teach that again while I'm at Purdue. So Haidt's going to draw attention to 3 key features of virtue ethics. We talked about this also in a lecture on normative ethical theories in the first week. So the first feature of virtue ethics is this. Virtue ethicists want to not just teach children rules, and they don't just want adults to simply obey rules. It's not just about the rules. Instead, it's about your perceptions, your emotions, your intuitions, how we shape them as children, and how we as adults have the right emotions and perceptions and intuitions ourselves. So it's not just figuring out the rules and then knowing what rules to apply to what situation. It's more about like the whole human being in a sense. And you find this throughout Indian, Persian, Greek, Christian, and Muslim writings. This is every culture you can think of. This is not just a Western thing. So the second feature is that virtues are multiple. So unlike, say, consequentialism or utilitarianism, where all of morality is reduced to this single rule, or increase good consequences, virtues are multiple. They're pluralist in a sense. You can't reduce them to one thing. Two, they're local, so they're saturated with cultural meanings. Recall what McIntyre says about morality, kind of being local, specific to a culture in a sense. And three, building on two, they're context or role specific. So the virtues of farmers, for example, differ from those of warriors, which differ from those of nomads, which differ from you Purdue undergrads, and also probably differs from Purdue instructors. What it is to be a good warrior is different from what it is to be a good farmer. Okay. Three, the third feature of virtue ethics is that their virtue ethics approaches to morality emphasize practice and habit. In a sense, emphasize doing, as opposed to just mere propositional knowledge and deliberative reasoning. It's now it doesn't exclude theory per se. It's not only a theory. It's the practice of the theory. It's applying it. It's doing versus simply knowing, I guess. And so, the next bullet point conveys this better. It says virtues are skills. They're skills specifically of social perception and action, which are acquired and refined over a lifetime. So think of other skills like playing the violin well. You don't just memorize. You don't read a book on how to play the violin and just memorize what the book says. You practice. You do it yourself, and then over time you get a skill that you can improve over your lifetime. So you don't just become virtuous just by memorizing a list of rules. You practice it. Okay. All right. So Haidt then talks about this great narrowing. This is the liberal moralities. During the Enlightenment, as societies in the West became more secular, philosophers sought new foundations for morality and secular first principles. So, for example, two approaches dominated, and this should be reviewed. Deontology, or what we called non-consequentialism in a lecture a few weeks ago, and then consequentialism, which you're all familiar with. This was the two kind of moralities that came out of the Enlightenment. Deontologists, non-consequentialists, they're focused on duties. The rightness and wrongness of actions, irrespective of their consequences. Rawls he's a contractarian, but he's also kind of a deontologist. He's definitely a non-consequentialist. Consequentialists argue that actions are judged by their consequences alone. So their maxim is act always in a way that brings about the greatest total good. This should be review, by the way. Of course, these two moralities, non-consequentialism, or what Haidt calls deontology, and consequentialism, they clash. That is, they can't both be true. They're inconsistent with each other, even though they have a lot in common. One, parsimony. They're kind of very simple. They come from a simple rule or principle. Two, they emphasize reason. So moral decision-making on both theories is kind of like logic or calculation in math. It's not like felt, in a sense. Utilitarianism or consequentialism especially, if you could just put a numerical value to consequences, to the goodness or badness of consequences, then you could put it in an Excel file and just calculate the different outcomes and then decide based on the numerical values that you get returned. Three, they both demand impartiality. Haidt doesn't mention this, but I do. Both those theories, these Enlightenment theories of the Great Narrow, emphasize impartiality. This is what McIntyre recognizes. And then four, they shrink the scope of morality from what kind of person should I become, which is the great question of virtue ethics, to what is the right thing to do. So instead of focusing on the whole person, it focuses on just individual actions. So that's a definite sense of narrowing. All right, how this impacted ethics courses and ethics textbooks is ethics turned into what Haidt calls quandary ethics. Ethics, once you reduce ethics as consequentialism or deontology propose that you do, you just be ethical reasoning is focused on quandaries like the trolley. So I gave this example multiple times. You have a trolley with going down the track, and you have one person on the left tied and 5 people on the right. What do you do? And what people's intuitions tell them to do in these various quandaries is supposed to give you somehow guidance or I guess knowledge into morality somehow. Okay, moral psychology, which is a field of ethics and psychology as well. It became a discipline that studied how people solved quandaries. And moral philosophy became a discipline that argued for and against various moral theories from those quandaries. So psychology kind of emphasize the descriptive aspect of those quandaries. Well, how do people actually reason when faced with these quandaries? And then moral philosophy was the normative aspect. What are you to do when you encounter these quandaries? So, if you ever saw the movie Speed, the famous pop quiz hot shot, shoot the hostage. That's kind of a nice Hollywood take on quandary ethics. Now, not discounting quandary ethics, I'm just saying that Heist's saying there's got to be a lot more to that ethics than just quandary ethics. It's a part, but not the whole. But it's in how it become the whole, mistakenly. Okay. So individuals, when solving quandaries, usually are allowed to rely on two distinctively moral sets of, moral concerns. Pardon the redundancy. Harm and care. So this would be concerns about suffering, nurturance, and the welfare of people. And the other one is fairness or reciprocity. And this is concern about justice and rights. Who owes what to whom? Getting what you deserve. So a fair allocation of resources. Ending suffering. And we're going to deal with a lot of articles in global ethics throughout the semester that are concerned with precisely those two categories, and they're going to be relying on precisely those two categories to propose a lot of stuff. This is certainly a part of morality. But this is how we've kind of what has been emphasized. Okay, so we're going to play a game. Jim purchases a dead chicken from the local market. Once he gets home, he first has sex with a dead chicken. He then adds some seasoning to it and bakes the dead chicken for the required time. Several hours later, he adds some butter and enjoys a nice meal by himself. Let that sink in for a second. Okay? That's just a story I told. Alright. Now, I have a hunch that most of you had a gut reaction to that story. And that gut reaction was that Jim did something wrong. There's just something wrong with what Jim did. Okay? Most people have that gut reaction to it, that just strong intuition. Jim did something wrong. Okay? So here's the game. I want you to explain to me how what Jim did was wrong using consequentialism or deontology, non-consequentialism. That is, show that in Jim having sex with a dead chicken before eating it, that there was a harm or care violation or a fairness or reciprocity violation on Jim's part. Think about it. I'll count. Wait a few seconds. I'm cool with some silence. All right. Think. Okay. All right. Hold that in mind. My hunch actually is that, and I've done this in classes, and this is actually an empirical study from Jonathan Haidt's book. This is a study Haidt did. I know it's a gross example, but that's why I picked it. I picked it for a reason. So Haidt did this same example, and asked people to do the same thing. Explain how that was wrong using those categories: harm, care, or fairness, reciprocity. Basically using consequentialist or deontological reasoning. Most people can't come up with a reason why what Jim did was wrong using those categories. Okay. My hunch is you didn't either. Maybe you enlightened folks in this class immediately said there is nothing wrong. I have a feeling of disgust, but that doesn't mean there's something wrong with it. It just means I have a feeling of disgust. Okay, fair enough. You're a good Enlightenment moral philosopher then. All right, we're going to play one more game. Tim and Tanya are biological siblings. They're brother and sister. Have the same mom and dad. They love each other very much, like many brothers and sisters. One weekend, they decided to go to the beach. Late on Friday night, Tim and Tanya decide to express their sibling love for each other by having sex with each other. Tim and Tanya both take the necessary precautions to ensure that Tanya doesn't get pregnant and no potential for sexually transmitted diseases is spread. Afterwards, they clean up, agree to tell no one else, and cherish the memories of their experience for the rest of their lives. Let that story sink in. I'm pretty sure you all have a gut reaction to that story. It's probably similar to the gut reaction you had to the story about Jim and the dead chicken, and it is that is wrong. What the hell is wrong with Tim and Tanya? That's messed up. Seriously, WTF. Alright, a few more seconds. Alright, same game. Explain how what Tim and Tanya did was wrong using consequentialism or deontology, that is non-consequentialist reasoning. In other words, show me that there was a harm slash care or a fairness slash reciprocity violation on Tim and Tanya's part. All right. Think about it for a few seconds. Again, this is an example that Jonathan Haidt used in a study with a lot of people from around the world. And generally, most people could not explain why what Tim and Tanya did was wrong, especially when the only categories they can appeal to are harm and care or fairness and reciprocity. I mean, if you think about it. So, who was really harmed when Jim had sex with a dead chicken? The chicken's dead. It's not like it feels anything. It's not like Jim was physically harmed. And he cooked it afterwards. And Tim and Tanya, they took all the precautions. There was not going to be pregnancy or spread of diseases. They're both mature people. They're not going to tell anyone. Whatever. Just, seriously, there was no, like, harm, care. Who are they being unfair to? So that's the answer. You can't do that. You can't explain why that is wrong using those categories. So you enlightened folks will just say, there is nothing wrong. I have a disgust reaction that comes from reading about it, but that doesn't mean there's anything that was wrong. Okay? Good. All right. We're going to return to those examples in a few slides. So, back to kind of the different moralities, the old versus the new, the traditional versus the Enlightenment morality. So, according to Haidt, prior to the narrowing, and still dominant in many parts of the world, is this kind of community morality, what he calls a Gemeinschaft, which is in contrast to the civil society morality, the Gesellschaft, dominant in, well, the West, like the United States, and inherited from the Enlightenment. The community morality is dominant in the traditional and until recently most widespread form of human organization, where there are small and enduring communities of people bound together by shared blood, place, and belief. So nowadays we have New York, Chicago, LA, London, these kind of like urban metropolises. There are melting pots. Even in Lafayette, it's a college town with a huge international population. Throughout most of human history, we were just organized in these very small groups of people that were just a lot like us, and we had to survive, okay? And we had blood in common. We were in the same location, and we also had similar beliefs about religion and so on, okay? And morality was kind of rooted in these communities. So nowadays, of course, in this cosmopolitan world, there's obviously going to be some differences. All right, so modern psychology and modern moral thought has been predominantly the study of civil society. Society is not like those small clannish groups, but places like London, Paris, Chicago. Societies in which individuals are free to move about, make choices for themselves, and design whatever lives they choose, so long as they don't harm or cheat others. So basically, the rule is you can do whatever you want as long as you don't harm someone else. Now, if the world in fact were a big civil society like that, and who knows, maybe in 1,000 years it will be, then that'd be fine, according to Haidt. That Enlightenment morality would be sufficient. But the thing is, the world is not like that. Don't believe me? Travel somewhere. Travel to a non-first world country. Or travel to a first world country but go away from the city and go to one of the smaller villages. Get on the road in Indiana. Drive to one of those farm communities. Many of you probably grew up in that. So some of the stuff we see might be familiar to you. This is just a descriptive fact. The world is not the way Enlightenment morality kind of assumes it is. Alright, so Haidt's kind of proposing that we study the psychological mechanisms and social structures that mutually influence each other as the world actually is, not as the way the Enlightenment thinkers assume it is. So, in the sense that it's still the world is mostly still kind of clannish. That is, instead of just specifying the content of morality, we should also examine the function of morality. So, morality kind of arose from this kind of clannish groups for various reasons, mostly for the survival and flourishing of those groups. Morality is like kind of a structure in place that helps a group, move on. That's why we punish murderers, because that's not good for a group. When we punish dishonest people and thieves. I quote Haidt, moral systems are interlocking sets of values, virtues, norms, practices, identities, institutions, technologies, and evolved psychological mechanisms that work together to suppress or regulate selfishness and make cooperative social life possible. So these clannish groups of human beings, which dominated history, required cooperative social behavior in order for them to survive. And of course, the individuals in the group, for the most part, depended on the survival of the clan for the survival of the individuals. For food and protection from other clans and so on. And morality was some kind of like mechanism or set of mechanisms in place that ensured that. So this, according to Haidt, if you assume that, allows you to move from what he calls a moral parochialism to a moral pluralism. So what's moral parochialism? It's the belief that there is one universal moral domain that happens to include the values that secular academics tend to value the most. And I guess Democrats. I could just imagine Haidt thinking that, although he is a Democrat. Moral pluralism, which is the approach he's defending or advocating for. By the way, Haidt, we'll get to Haidt's political views. He's, well, I'll just say it right now. Yeah, we'll get to that in a few slides. It's not what you think. All right, so moral pluralism, the view that he's defending in this article is the view that there are multiple defensive but incompatible approaches to morality that serve to suppress selfishness. Now, this isn't the same thing as the embedded self view that we looked at, or McIntyre's view, but it's very close to it. Very close to it. Okay? So, Haidt says that there's, in fact, when you take into account these descriptive facts about human beings and human nature, in the large bulk of the article is him advancing this theory of morality that explains this, how morality functions to kind of promote the survival of these groups. He thinks that there's actually 5 different foundations of morality. So we looked at 2 earlier. Harm and care, and then fairness. Let's just go back. What did it say? Harm, care, and fairness and reciprocity. Those are the 2 kind of enlightenment categories. So he thinks that there's not just 2, but there's actually 5. And this is better explanation of human history and most of human communities in the world today. So we'll get to those 5 foundations in a second. So humans survive in communities, which are not the same thing as civil societies. Remember, communities, common blood, common values, common location. They survived for large periods of time. But to do so required these humans to have evolved various psychological mechanisms that ensured their survival. They had to suppress selfishness and reward altruism, for example. That's what it took for a group to survive. Think about it. A group of thieves doesn't survive well. If you ever saw Lord of the Rings, a group of orcs did not survive nearly as well as a group of humans because they had, altruism wasn't suppressed as much. Okay. So, Haidt further draws attention to a wealth of research that shows that humans actually do need groups to function. We need others. And this was an assumption of virtue ethics. You never read Aristotle, but Aristotle says that man is a political animal. So if humans need groups to survive, and he goes into detail about this in the article, so I'm just kind of pulling out the main points, then groups also need to survive. Well, what is key then for what it takes for groups to survive is the psychological mechanisms and culture features are needed. For groups need to maintain solidarity in the face of external threats. They need to prevent members of the group from harming the rest of the group, and the groups need to be bonded in such a way that they persist over time. So they need to survive. So he thinks for groups to survive, there's actually 5 foundations of morality, not 2. Now, included in it is the ones that we looked at earlier, harm and care and fairness and reciprocity, but there's 3 other categories that were needed for group kind of survival. Third category is in-group loyalty. So this concerns, it's related to obligations of group membership such as loyalty, self-sacrifice, and vigilance against betrayal. So recall McIntyre's article that we in the military, you kind of can't be an enlightenment moral thinker. You have to, be willing to die for your group. And that the 4th category is authority and respect. This concerns related to social order and obligations of hierarchical relationships, such as obedience, respect, and fulfillment. So in the clans, you respect your chiefs. And then 5, purity and sanctity. This is concerns about physical and spiritual contagion, including virtues of chastity, wholesomeness, and control of desires. Okay, so those are kind of the 5 foundations of morality. So humans and cultures, according to Haidt, have evolved to have these kind of moral taste buds, these 5 moral taste buds. and they still play a dominant role in many parts of the world, with the exception of parts of the West. These 5 foundations are what it takes for groups to survive, according to Haidt, and he goes into detail about that in the article. Further, many groups still do flourish today because of these 5 foundations. They make moral judgments based on these 5 foundations, not just simply on the first 2. So they might say it's wrong to have sex with a dead chicken because it's impure. So this doesn't violate the first 2 categories, it violates the 5th category. Okay? And there's a reason we have this category in our moral thought, and we make judgments based on it. Okay. And many groups that still rely upon these judgments are doing quite well. They're surviving quite well. He draws attention to ethnic enclaves in the United States. I think the specific example he gives is Orthodox Jews selling jewelry. They're doing quite well, and that's definitely the 5 foundations are at play in their moral thought. So today, how does this relate to political debates? Well, political liberals, like not philosophical liberals, but political liberals, tend to follow the first 2 foundations in their moral decisions: fairness and reciprocity, and harm and care. Political conservatives, though, tend to use all 5. And this can explain why we tend to talk past each other, because we got different moral taste buds. Okay, so that's Haidt's main idea.